Good morning, guests and family members. And it's 9:30 on a Saturday morning, but we're making it happen. And it's that part of the semester too where Saturday feels a little bit like Friday, feels a little bit like Thursday. The days are all kind of blending together. A lot of the academic work is spilling into kind of 7-day work weeks with students. So I live that life. I feel that pain, and we are home stretching it. And this is kind of the culmination too of an entire academic career. It's very, very, I would say original and unique. I went to an undergrad institution where I was in an honors program as well, and we didn't get something this cool. It's a really awesome thing that Plan II puts together every year for the Honors Symposium, and sharing so many different perspectives and so many different research ideas. Quite frankly, I didn't know almost anything about what any of the 140 presenters were talking about this year. And that's a good thing, that we are shining light on stories and hearing voices that we often don't hear about. So it's a fantastic thing. I also realized that I am in the straight A room. We have Anthony and Apurva and Amanda and Allison. So I am just lucky this morning. It should be fantastic presentations. To let everyone know in the audience, presenters are going to have about 8 minutes to deliver their findings and to enlighten us about their topics. And then we'll have 8 minutes or so for some Q&A, and I'll be moderating that session. My name is Zach. I've worked for Plan II for almost 5 years now as an admissions reader. And this spring, I was fortunate enough to be asked to help with the Plan II Symposium here. And it's been a fantastic experience. I've learned a lot. I'm very fortunate to be involved with a group of intellectuals such as this. We're also in the W.E.B. Du Bois room, and this room was organized because these stories and all of these research topics and these ideas are all about the ethos of liberating voices. And that's what W.E.B. Du Bois dedicated his entire career to. It was about representation in government. It was about equitable economic policies. It was about doing right for all people and making sure that Black folks have every opportunity to be represented in government and in politics and in the media. Huge monumental speaker. If you have not read The Souls of Black Folk, do that yesterday, because it is hyper important. But all of these presentations today are kind of fitting in that ethos of liberating voices and connecting people to representation and to structures of power, which is awesome. So we are going to get started today. I'm going to kick it over to Anthony. Anthony, introduce your topic to us, enlighten us. I'm excited. Let's do it.
Unmute myself and let me share my screen. Awesome. Can you guys all see that? Can I get like a thumbs up? Awesome. Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Anthony Douglas. I am a graduating senior for Plan II in government. And today I want to talk to you guys about how the United States can reimagine its approach to counter-narcotics policy in the Andean region, looking specifically at Ecuador and Peru as case studies. And so this is of interest because at first I was studying foreign aid policies as a measure of economic power and soft power in Latin America. And I quickly noticed that the US put most of its foreign aid in the region towards counter-narcotics policies, stopping the flow of drugs and specifically cocaine to the United States. And this is of interest because the United States is the largest consumer of cocaine in the world, with approximately 60% of cocaine flowing to the US, right? We spend about $100 billion combined on cocaine derivatives, and marijuana. And as we change our views domestically on how we should approach our domestic war on drugs, changing how we view the opioid crisis from one of public safety to one of public health, changing stances on marijuana legislation nationally, and the 2018 First Step Act that addressed racial inequities of the 1990s crime bill, I was very curious about how we are changing and shifting our perspectives about foreign policy. And so at first, in order to do this, I first wanted to understand what have we done. And so I did a literary analysis and a historical review of US policies and relations with Ecuador and Peru from 1960 to 2014. The thesis focuses on 1980, as that is where the war on drugs really begins. I also did a data analysis of foreign aid using R and Excel. And then the second half of my thesis, I go over a proposal, a reimagination, if you will, of how the US can approach its foreign policy, looking at various international relations theories, and specifically looking at the understanding that prohibition-based policies increase the cost on shipping and producing countries. And so let's quickly go over the history of US relations. When it comes to Peru, the history of US relations with Peru is one based on counter narcotics since the 1980s, as Peru was the largest producer and cultivator of cocaine in the world. The United States has put forward policies focusing on blanket forced eradication, meaning that they are forcefully removing the coca cultivation from the people, as well as widespread interdiction, meaning that across the country, government, military would use planes to basically intercept any clandestine flights or flights that were not seen as legitimate. And this forced eradication often ended up hurting the state's legitimacy, decreasing the support for states' efforts, being used and by malicious actors and insurgents, harming violence, and moving cultivation around, which is known as the balloon effect. Interdiction often focused on small farmers or middlemen, not going after the larger drug trafficking organizations. This ran from 1991 to 2001, the Aerial Bridge Denial Program, only ending because in 2001, Peru shot down a US missionary Baptist plane. This program had a host of human rights violations that had to be waived under President Clinton. And ultimately, the United States' policies and goals in Peru were counterproductive and ineffective, only helping out directly when cases of counterinsurgency when it helped with counter narcotics. In Ecuador, the United States is what we have a transit country. A transit country is one where there is a large possibility and probability for to the transshipment of narco trafficking drugs as well as money laundering. The United States has had a pretty cooperative partner with Ecuador. 1990 saw the US training police, as well as the passing of US-backed prohibition-based laws such as Law 108, that saw the drastic increase of detentions in jail for minor substances ranging from 12 to 16 years for your first offense and up to 25 years for multiple substances. Ecuador also leased Fort Manta to the United States in 1999 that served as the base point of military operations. And in 2000, Ecuador shifted to the US dollar due to economic turmoil of the 90s. However, Ecuador really wasn't a strategic partner for the United States until after 2001 due to the tragic events of 9/11. The United States shifted its policies away from narco trafficking and towards narco terrorism. And as you can see, Ecuador sits at the border of Colombia, which holds a narco terrorist group known as the FARC. It became of strategic importance. However, this importance was pretty short-lived with the election of Rafael Correa in 2007, whose policies created a low-risk environment that increased narco trafficking. He repealed Law 108, ended the US leasing of Fort Manta, and ended the majority of US military and aid operations in 2014. There are specific harms and abuses that I do want to highlight in this presentation, although I do go over more in my thesis. One is the environmental damage that the United States caused. Through aerial spraying of herbicides. This had unintended causes of downstream harm, corrupting the water supply, hurting the Amazon, and pushing farmers towards more illicit and illegal crop cultivation as their legal crops were ruined. The United States also aided and abetted corruption, weakening political institutions. And one example of this is Vladimir Mostacino, a CIA-backed asset that was the de facto head of Peru's National Intelligence Service. He used CIA money and equipment to spy on Peru's Congress, as well as provided 10,000 arms to Colombia's narco-terrorist group, the FARC. The United States had knowledge of this. However, and I quote, "We did nothing because he solved problems, even problems he created himself." The United States also drastically increased political violence. Beyond moving the cultivation of coca, which is known as the balloon effect, the United States also pushed for forced eradication efforts and the prioritization of these efforts over counterinsurgency. Furthermore, the detentions saw a drastic increase that directly went against certain provisions of Ecuador's constitution that viewed drugs as a public health issue and not as one of public safety. So we know that these things aren't working. We know that what we're doing is not operating. The United States in 2020 put out a report stating very clearly that US-supported counter-narcotic policies sometimes cause considerable harms, although sometimes it's pushing it. However, complicating rather than curbing drug trafficking and drug-related crime. So we know what we're doing isn't working. We know that we've caused a host of human rights abuses. And so how can we go about changing that? And so that was my whole proposal. The second half of my thesis was, after understanding all of the history, and of course my thesis goes into far more depth about what happens, after understanding the history, the harms and abuses, how can we go about shifting and changing our foreign policy in the area? So first, we wanted to look at interdiction. And we want to provide greater priority to water-based routes, as right now we give greater priority to air. And in Ecuador, water-based routes are used and have been used increasingly. Furthermore, we want to remain within a range of the border. This reduces the chance of conflict with farmers. Most international narco trafficking occurs within ranges of the border, and this has a greater chance of catching drug trafficking organizations that have the chance to systematically corrupt the state. Furthermore, here, consistency is key. The Air Bridge Denial Program was only going for 38% of the time that it was in its existence. It wasn't present for a lot of the time, and that in itself is an issue. Concerning eradication, it does not need to be blanketed, but targeted and strategic, not forced, but in negotiation with the community. It does not need to be aerial herbicide spraying, but alternative development does need to be put into place before we can start eradication. And that's when we get into my mainstay, is that I focus mostly on alternative development as the main policy proposal. We need to flip the current 2-to-1 ratio that favors supply side strategies and flip it in favor of alternative development. And while we understand that alternative development may have a limited effect in decreasing the cultivation, comprehensive with supply side, it increases support for the eradication and interdiction efforts. Furthermore, the goal is to make illicit crop market so that people can make viable livings at a far lower risk than what's currently available, as well as prevent going towards the illegal market. And we want to focus on infrastructure. Here I have a picture that shows the increase of rural infrastructure from Plan Ecuador. And we should focus on that, especially in the rural areas, as that is where cultivation or the transshipment happens the most. And lastly, we need to strengthen the institutions and the rule of law. We need to focus more on diplomacy, remove US military involvement, and training as much as possible, and train them with our drug enforcement agencies, not with our military. We should support an independent judiciary, as a weak one is unable to successfully prosecute crime, providing both impunity to the narco traffickers and to government corruption. And lastly, we need to increase transparency on both our account and theirs. We should know exactly where every US dollar is going to, and we should hold ourselves accountable in terms of our own corruption. And lastly, we need to be humane. I want to end by making note that every single policy that we implement, every single dollar that we put forward has the ability to hurt or help an individual and has the ability to hurt or help the problem. We've already caused so much harm. We need to make sure that every single policy that we put forward and every policy that I have put forward is humane and takes into account the humanity of every single individual. Thank you.
Fantastic, Anthony. Thank you. While audience members are drumming up a few questions, please let us know in the chat if you do have any questions, and I'll kind of be moderating those for Anthony and directing those as we go. Anthony, I have a question. When you talked about the narco trafficking and how drugs get from point A to point B, unfortunately, I immediately thought of advancements in technology. And I have seen, for instance, in Austin, I have seen drone deliveries, packages being delivered by a drone. And this is technology that is going to make, I'm assuming, narco trafficking harder to police, harder to pin down with policy. How do you see technology making policy advocacy and making the policing more difficult? And then how does policy keep up with the technology?
That's actually a really good question. So that's one of the issues that we had when it came to the Air Bridge Denial Program, is that narco traffickers could easily get around everything because, one, we didn't fund them with adequate equipment, or they just had updated technology. And so, one, that requires the United States to maintain its technological hegemony, as well as maintaining its technological superiority and putting the funds towards that. And naturally, we're not going to. One thing I talk about is that we're not going to be able to get everything. We have to change how we view eradication and supply side strategies towards try to get as much as possible, but understand that we're not going to get it all. And so when it comes to that, to technological innovation and changes, one, it's about providing the updated equipment, the radars necessary, and of course, our military. Let me not say that. And of course, our military has the capabilities for doing that, but it is also a matter of that means providing greater interdiction capabilities. So that means putting capabilities for drone interdiction, putting those radar capabilities out there. And so we're not going to be able to get everything, especially when it comes to drones. I mean, as bad as this may sound, there are drug trafficking drones literally in Austin, as you said, and I've talked to people about that. But the most that we can do at this moment is really looking at radars and looking at how artificial intelligence could allow us, and computer vision could allow us to capture those when they take off and when they're in proximity to local areas.
Interesting. That's fascinating. And I have one follow-up too. In your research, I know you were focused mainly on kind of the triumvirate of US, Ecuador, Peru, but did you find a country who was doing it well that you
Bolivia.
felt like had some good policies? What were those like? Who were they and what were those like?
Bolivia has interesting policies. They've actually kicked out our drug enforcement agencies, which has been very interesting. Because part of it is there is specific licensing that's happening because coca is a historic plant. Has been used historically for spiritual instances, for just basic medicines. And so Bolivia has been a pretty good example of how to kind of cut down the supply of cocaine or of drugs. At that same point, United States policy has not been that great. So, as I mentioned, cocaine cultivation has increased, has continued to go up. And even when it's had its small instances of going down, it hasn't really gone down for more than 2 years at a time. And so Bolivia, I think, is a pretty good country or example of what could happen. But at the same time, we're going to have to wait and see because we've only been able to keep it down for 2 years at a time max.
Yeah. Yeah, and then as political leaders change, it's like policies change that quickly, and then you can backtrack on lots of progress you've made. We had one question come in from the chat. It's kind of hinting at the U.S. interventionism that the U.S. tends to kind of conduct violently or non-violently across the globe. One question: why should the U.S. continue trying to help or intervene in other countries? Why don't we focus more on issues here at home? Is there not a war on drugs here at home that we could tackle more? Anthony, how do you feel about that?
I absolutely love that question, and I think there are two parts to this. So America is the hemispheric hegemon. We have the most power, and we use that leverage. Whether it is appropriate, whether we use that leverage is a different question, but we do use it. And America is the highest consumer of cocaine in the world. Part of this is we are addressing what's going on at home. We're not doing it at the pace that we need to, but we're slowly shifting funds towards more demand-based reduction. So that means public health as opposed to viewing it as a public safety issue. So less criminalization of issues and more therapy, more prevention. The issue with that is that doesn't, one, necessarily stop supply, and two, the United States still has cause-specific harms that we should address and that we should do our best to fix, right? Go back and make up. And it's also a matter of we have relations with those countries, right? We do have, because we messed up a lot of things, we should address those. But on a specific matter, there's development issues that are related to those countries that we have the opportunity and ability to help out with, that is directly related to our drug problem, that we could all in all help prevent. So part of it is we are doing things at home, and then part of it is the prevention matters on their side. Part of it is they're putting a lot of money towards there that they don't already have enough. Peru has put about $60 million towards their war on drugs. That's a lot of money already, and it's not doing much. And if we know that we have the financial capabilities of helping, and we know that we have caused harms, and we know that we can go back and fix that, we should. Now, does that mean that we should take over their autonomy? No, and I do talk about that. We should take their lead on a lot of this, especially when it comes to examples like Bolivia, where they've been successful. But the US has already caused damage, and we should do our best to rectify that damage.
Yeah. Awesome. Preach. Don't see any more questions in the chat. I will give everyone just kind of a few more seconds. If you do want to ask kind of one last question in the chat, please let us know, and I can kind of direct that question to Anthony. So if anyone else has anything, speak now or forever hold your peace kind of thing. Okay, I think we're good. Well, Anthony, fantastic work. Awesome job addressing the questions. Those were not some softballs. So excellent work.
Thank you. Have a nice day, and please get vaccinated the moment you guys can.
Agreed. Thank you, Anthony. Awesome. For sake of time, we're gonna forge on here, crew. Amanda, you are up next. Share your screen and tell us a little bit more about what you're researching. I'm looking forward to it.
All right. Okay. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Taylor. Hi, everyone. My name is Amanda Hua. And well, before I start, I want to give a quick shout out to my thesis supervisor and second reader, Dr. Crew and Dr. Lewis. They have carried me through this process, held my hand through it virtually, so big shout out to them. So I want to start off just by talking about what's on this slide. So in Germany, there is this memorial project created by an artist named Günther Demnig, and these are called the Stolpersteine, which translates to stumbling stones. And they're these little brass plaques that are embedded into the road, and they demarcate the last places that Jewish victims and other victims of the Holocaust lived before they were forcibly deported to concentration camps. And so I felt like these stones were an accurate visual representation of how I felt when I was in Germany studying abroad 2 years ago. It felt like I was constantly stumbling upon memorial after memorial or reminders of the past everywhere I went. And so I later learned that the Germans actually have a word to describe these memorial processes and to describe the public debate and public guilt that surrounds the Nazi past. So that's Vergangenheitsbewältigung or Vergangenheitsaufarbeitung. And this translates to working off the past, working through the past, overcoming the past. There are a lot of other words too. So this is a big thing in Germany and German culture. And so this is what led me to this topic and my interest in German memorialization as well as American memorialization. And so the question that I was primarily interested in my research, the one that I started out with, was how can we use memorial sites and specifically sites of atrocity, where sites of mass murder and mass violence and just a lot of horror and pain, and how can we use those to help us commemorate the past and transform those into sites of memory. But along the way, my research started to kind of take me into areas of digital memory. And so my second research topic came like halfway through the year, and that is this question of how social media plays a role in shaping historical memory. So I grounded my exploration of these two topics in two particular sites. One is Sachsenhausen Memorial and Museum in Oranienburg, Germany. It's a little bit north of Berlin. The other one is the Whitney Plantation Museum in Wallace, Louisiana, which is in between New Orleans and Baton Rouge. So I think both do a really good job of illustrating some of the complicated, layered dynamics of crafting memories. So yeah, let's get started with Sachsenhausen. So Sachsenhausen was created in 1936, and it was viewed as the ideal concentration camp. It was a place where SS officers were trained and where execution methods were practiced and perfected on inmates. So from 30,000 to 50,000 people are estimated to have been killed there. In April 1945, it was liberated by the Soviet Army. Fast forward a decade-ish, and Sachsenhausen was first opened as a memorial site by the German Democratic Republic, aka East Germany, aka the GDR, in 1961. So what was the GDR's vision for this site? They wanted to overcome the Nazi past, but they also wanted a really heroic memorialization that would kind of solidify their new national identity as a new, better German state, better than the West Germans on the other side. So they wanted to proclaim this narrative of communist triumph over fascism. And this kind of conflicted with the survivors of Sachsenhausen's wishes for the site. So Nazi-era buildings were removed, new monuments were constructed, some of which are shown on the screen here. And these monuments were constructed to project the GDR's narrative of strength and victory and class struggle. And on the flip side of that, what was neglected in this commemoration was the horrors that were actually experienced during the Nazi era, and victim groups that were not imprisoned for political reasons were also excluded. After Germany was reunited in 1990, though, a bit of a shift. So a more decentralized concept began to emerge, and we have now a more expansive representation of all victim groups. So today's Sachsenhausen Memorial and Museum includes the GDR era relics, but it also includes, it's a much more expansive story. And so it also controversially commemorates those who were imprisoned by the Soviets after 1945, when the camp was used as a Soviet special camp. And so that means that one part of the camp also commemorates the Nazis who were held in the Soviet special camp after the Holocaust ended. So Sachsenhausen, that's why I find it to be such an interesting site. It also has an exhibit, which I show a bit of in this bottom right corner, called From Memory to Monument, that critically comments on its own development as a memorial site. So the exhibit's a little bit meta. It speaks to Vergangenheitsbewältigung, and it pulls back the curtain on like the behind the scenes process in a way that not many other memorial sites do. And then on our side of the ocean again, so the Whitney Plantation was founded by German immigrant Ambrose Heidel in 1752. The number of enslaved people grew from 20 to over 100 as the indigo and sugar plantation was passed through generations of the Heidel family. After the Civil War, it resumed its sugarcane operations with sharecroppers, many of whom had formerly been enslaved on the site. And then by 1990, it was acquired by a petrochemical corporation called Formosa Chemicals. And interestingly, like that chemical corporation actually started to lay the groundwork for the memorial site that came later. In 1999, the Whitney was sold to a wealthy white former lawyer named John Cummings. And on December 7th, 2014, the Whitney opened as what many call the first slavery museum in the United States. It had a very unconventional path to becoming a memorial site, namely because John Cummings almost single-handedly spearheaded the effort. He spent 15 years and $8 million of his own money to transform the plantation. And this is not very commonly done on memorial sites. And because of this, he could also circumvent like the long processes that are normally required to bring memorials to life, like artist proposals, board member debates, and fundraising. Also due to this, he had all the creative control. And while he did consult experts like his research director, Dr. Seck, he commissioned all of the monuments, like the ones that are pictured here on the screen, the Children of the Whitney and the Angel. And he just basically had control over all of this. And this is also him featured in this bottom photograph. And the Whitney is also uniquely positioned because of its status as a plantation museum. As some of you may know or may not know, most plantation museums are not like this. Jennifer Eichstädt and Stephen Small actually visited over 100 plantation museums, and they found that the vast majority romanticize the glamorous lives of the wealthy slave owners. They showcase the architecture and the furnishings, and they just neglect any mention of the people who built all of the pretty things. And it's really not a comprehensive narrative at all. But the Whitney goes out of its way to counter those narratives. And especially because it's surrounded by plantations like that, the Whitney is really in like a special position to do so. So despite the ways that these sites have evolved over time, there are certain limitations. And so I began to notice in my research that at these sites of memory and others like them, there's usually not a balanced relationship between the producers and the consumers of memory. So these sites are open to visitors, but the visitors have to engage with the memory in a prescribed way, and they are often reduced to passive spectators in doing so. So for example, at the Whitney, the guided tour is an essential aspect of the experience. Visitors aren't allowed to wander the site freely until after they have paid for a tour and the tour is over. So there are these spaces for reflection and these memorial spaces, but the visitors only get a limited amount of time on the tour to engage with them before they have to move on, and then they can come back afterwards, but it's a long tour, yeah. And so the role of visitors at memorial sites is just to listen and to absorb the narrative told them through the exhibits and the plaques and the trained tour guides. In response to this, however, some memorial makers have created these counter monuments. And so these counter monuments are things that ask to be vandalized, that disappear over time. And so James Young, who is a leading scholar in Holocaust memory, writes about how such work subverts the didactic nature of monuments, conventional monuments. They don't tell the audience what to think, and they strive instead to engage and to challenge and just to subvert. And so the reason why I'm bringing up all of this is a bit of like a narrative thing, my presentation style, but as I was trying to figure out how to measure the reception to the Sachsenhausen and the Whitney, that's when digital memory started to come into the mix. Because I found that one way that people were reacting to these sites was by posting about their trips on social media. So Earl and Rigney used the term remediation to describe this process of consuming memory and then reproducing it in other mediums. And in this way, users can also exert agency and become producers of memory. So remediations are both acts of reception and acts of memorialization. And I argue in my thesis that social media is an interesting, chaotic kind of counter monument. Excuse me. It allows people, and especially tourists and visitors, to play a more active role that they don't necessarily get to at the actual physical sites. So I spent the last 5 months, you don't have to read all of this on the screen, this is just a tiny slice of everything, but I spent the last 5 months just tracking mentions of Sachsenhausen and the Whitney on social media. And I found throughout all of this, I don't really have the time to go into depth here about the themes that I pulled out, but I just found overall that these remediations allow the memory that's produced at these sites to gain a second life online. There is a wide range in how people choose to represent these sites, from ghost hunting videos at Sachsenhausen on the bottom to tons of vlogs, travel vlogs of all sorts. And each is interesting because they reflect a particular relationship the creator has to the history and just their own kind of individual memory with that. But then in the collective comment sections and Twitter threads, we also see collective memory happening in digital network spaces. And so, like Andrew Hoskins writes, I found that there is a new memory culture that's kind of emerging in today's digital age alongside the old institutionalized one that's represented by those sites I talked about earlier. This new one is emergent and fluid and fragmented. And yeah, it's really messy. So at the same time, it's important to acknowledge that social media is also a place where a lot of anti-Semitism festers, a lot of Holocaust denial and racism. And so naturally, there's a lot of conversations about how, whether social media is even a feasible place for memorialization and what role official memory institutions have in monitoring all this, what role the social media networks have, whether Twitter should be stepping in. And these are all complicated questions that I don't have the answer to necessarily, but I think it's important to just acknowledge that these sentiments exist and they are part of the memorial landscape. They do reflect relationships that people have with history. And so it's better to acknowledge that they exist and then proactively address them. And I think that social media, if anything, if it pulls out those sentiments and it allows us to have conversations about them, then that is what is really valuable about social media. And so all in all, I hope that these past few minutes have shown that memory, whether it is crafted at these historic sites or on social media platforms, is all mediated to a certain extent. And we're in this new era of memory that has truly been accelerated in the past year because of COVID-19, so much virtualness happening. And so I think there's a lot of potential for both digital memory and for analog memory to continue evolving and for us to continue learning how to reckon with our histories. So that is all I have. Thank you for listening. And if anyone has questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them.
Hey, good job, Amanda. Do I have questions? I have lots of questions. I think it was fascinating when you said, people, yourself, literally stumbling upon the memories, like literally stumbling upon the stones. And my 3 really standout memories with physical monuments. I remember going to the Holocaust Museum and experiencing that, crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, where MLK also crossed that bridge. And in the spring of 2017, on UT's campus, there was beginning that chatter of, do these Confederate monuments belong on campus? And then in the middle of the night, I think y'all were probably first-year students, right? Or second-year students, and those statues were gone, and the 6-pack was empty. And what remained standing really is a kind of a representation of what UT values and thinks should be celebration versus education. So Amanda, my question to you, when you talked about the Whitney Plantation and being a very paced educational experience and not a celebration of something, it's an education and memory of something. What's the difference? Where do we draw the line, and where do these monuments draw the line between positioning a monument as celebratory or positioning it as educational? What do you think about that?
That's a phenomenal question. Wow, I think that's one that every single memorial site kind of has to reckon with. Something that the Whitney has gotten criticized for is its portrayal of enslaved people. Like on one hand, there's this one particular monument at the Whitney that commemorates the 1811 German Coast Uprising, which was a really big slave rebellion that few people know about. And the memorial itself, it reflects how the punishment for these enslaved people who were eventually captured, they were beheaded. And so it's a bunch of stone heads on sticks. And so that has gotten a lot of backlash from the local community, from tons of people. Just, yeah, it's pretty emotionally intense to look at. But Cummings and Dr. Seck, the research director, have both just made it clear that for them, the Whitney is about disseminating truth and disseminating education. And that, I think, it's not that it's a mutually exclusive thing from celebrating just the progress that has been made. I think that just it's their prerogative as memorial sites to do the work and to spread the education and spread the truth, because for so long, the American narrative of memorialization has excluded the voices of people of color and the voices of these enslaved people. And so I think that first and foremost, for the Whitney, at least, I think it also differs from site to site, which is something that I was trying to get at in my thesis, that every single site, it has its own unique history, and that's what makes memory so interesting. There's no one size fit all answer. But I think for the Whitney in particular, like they have chosen to go the education route. And then on the other hand, so if some of y'all might know, but the University of Texas is currently kind of in the process of planning commemorations around Heme and Sweat and the precursors. And so I've kind of been a part of these discussions, just been really fortunate to kind of hear like what's going on. And like that is something that continually comes up, just the tensions between like the university kind of celebrating its role as like, we have been at the front of this higher education institutional inclusion movement, but we also have had really exclusive policies in the past. And so I think that my answer is kind of going in circles. I feel like I'm not really giving an answer, and I think it's just complicated, and that it's possible to hold these things, to hold education and celebration and also mourning all at once. And it's hard to, but I think that like leaning into all of those difficult tensions is part of what makes memory work so meaningful and so important. And also that's what makes change possible. So yeah.
Yeah, it's a very interesting space, UT Austin, for not having really memorialized Heme and Sweat, having broken the color barrier of the law school, and literally opening the door to the precursors in '68 and being those first African-American students to have earned their degrees and to have gone out in the community and having been those community members, right? A lot of the folks were from Austin, and they had that very kind of minoritized history that unfortunately, especially in East Austin is almost infamous for at this point. So yeah, fantastic. One last follow-up, I actually piggybacked a little bit on something you said earlier. Someone asked about the Whitney Museum and then other plantation museums and the disparity in the narratives. And you talked a little bit about how the stories are different and nuanced, but what does that mean when you're speaking about a historical phenomena, and where's the nuance lost? How do historians and how do advocates tell those stories?
I'm really, really glad that you asked this question, Vicki. Yeah, so something I want to say about the Whitney, like one of the reasons why I respect the Whitney's work so much is that I think it actually has really led to a shift in more plantation museums, like beyond, like the effect is kind of rippling out, because I've also read other articles about other plantations that have started to incorporate the narratives of the enslaved people into their own tours as well. And maybe not as much, not to the extent that the Whitney has, but I think that the Whitney has had a greater effect than we even know. Like we're still kind of in the phase of like seeing like what the actual reaction is, but I do think that like things are changing. And also beyond like the Whitney, there's also the relatively new National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. And so in general, like there are more museums that are centering the voices of the enslaved, centering other voices that have long been ignored. But in response to the question about the dialogue between the Whitney and the plantation museums, yeah, to be honest, I haven't really read that much into that yet, but I just would imagine that they're aware of what's going on. Like people are aware of like the discrepancies between these different tours, but people who go to the Whitney are like a different group of tourists than those who go to the other plantations. And so sometimes the Whitney will like catch tourists who expect something like what is offered at the other plantations. And like that is like, it's kind of interesting to go read the reviews of the Whitney online and see people who complain about there's too much stuff going on about slaves in this tour and that's not what I came for. And so I think that like they all kind of exist in an ecosystem, and that like it's that the Whitney is having an effect on these other plantations, because like it can't just be in a vacuum. Like the other plantations, like I think that there is movement in between them, and people are hearing things and changing things, and like also pushing other plantation museums to be held accountable.
Yeah, great point. And something that comes through really strong in your work and is a kind of a through line with what Anthony and Apurva were talking about is we can't stop talking. We can't let the discussion die, right? We have to keep communicating because that's how we learn and that's how we move forward. So fantastic work, Amanda. Thank you so much for that. And kind of connecting a line through all the things that we're learning today. Awesome, awesome stuff. Last but not least of the straight A's, Allison, let's share your screen. Let's hear about it. I'm looking forward to it. Last but certainly not least.
Thank you. My name is Allison White, and my thesis is about the political influence of the British monarchy on the US presidency. So the British monarchy was initially established as an absolute monarchy beginning in the 9th century, and this was promulgated by the concept of the divine rights of kings, which was the idea that the monarchs and their resulting dynasties were divinely appointed in their positions by God, so therefore subjects should adhere and exert total obedience to them. But however, this idea started to crumble with the introduction of Magna Carta in the 13th century, which introduced the idea of inherent individual liberties. And this ended up influencing the events in the Stuart dynasty with the English Civil War and Glorious Revolution that resulted in the monarchy transitioning into a constitutional monarchy that still exists today. So King George III was one of the first monarchs under this new type of monarchy. However, he still had a very strong relationship with Parliament and influence on the tenor and length of the prime ministers. And for this reason, he receives much criticism and blame for the American Revolution because Prime Minister North, who was the prime minister at the time, had similar ideology and attitudes towards the treatment of the colonists as did King George III. So this, as a result, the colonists overthrew the British government for the American Revolution. And this led me to ask, how did the British monarchy influence the origins of the US presidency? And how has this presidency reflected this influence over time, especially in the Washington and Adams administrations? For my methodology, I collected primary and secondary sources of literature and performed an analysis of President Washington and Adams to compare the similarities and differences of how the monarchy has influenced the institution of the presidency. So initially, in response to the British monarchy, the colonists formed a Continental Congress, which acted as an authoritative figure in making decisions regarding the American Revolution and drafting documents such as the Declaration of Independence, which again argued against a British tyrannical government of monarchy and went back to the ideals expressed in the Magna Carta. After winning the American Revolution, the colonists established the Articles of Confederation, which tried to be as anti-monarchical as possible with no executive government ever existing. However, this proved to be very weak and ineffective, and there became a recognized need for an executive establishment to exist. However, this led to questions of how to create this executive institution without identically replicating the British monarchy and staying true to the ideals of the American Revolution. So there were many debates that arose with this. James Madison, and especially in Federalist Number 48, advocated for a type of executive that was directly elected by the people, and also for the separation of branches of powers where Congress would not be choosing the president to avoid a situation similar to King George III in the Parliament. Alexander Hamilton, on the other hand, in Federalist Number 70, advocated for an idealized version of the British monarchy with a lifelong service, a unitary executive with full military powers and absolute veto power. So there was a lack of consensus of how to clearly define this executive institution. So as a result, in the finalized constitution that still exists today, they ended up strongly defining Congress in Article 1 to prevent the president usurping powers restricted to Congress. And they intentionally left the presidency very vague in Article 2 because they knew that George Washington was going to be the first president, and the founders had trust that he would uphold the ideas true to the formation of this country. So George Washington had a lot to establish in his first presidency and greatly shaped it in all his decisions and acts, creating expectations for future presidents to follow and for the American people and for the government to have of the presidency, such as its acts including creating a national bank and firing members of cabinet, established the idea that the president has implied powers, not specifically enumerated in the Constitution, and that these can be challenged if they're not enumerated to any branch of government. And also, it established the presidency as an independent executive authority that has the ability to make decisions independent of the other two branches of government, similar to the idea of a monarch being able to make ideas. And especially this is evident in the Neutrality Proclamation of 1793. This proclamation clarified US's position during the French Revolution as a position of total neutrality. And by issuing this, raised questions of constitutional authority in Washington's cabinet and also among the American people of whether the president had the authority to issue this declaration, and he argued he did under the Implied Powers Act. So it established the president that while Congress has the ability to make wars, presidents have the right to issue neutrality. And again, it reiterated the issue of implied powers, and also established that unlike monarchs, the US president would not get involved in conflicts that weren't directly related to the US presidency, which has continued over time up until the 20th century, arguably. And then his successor, John Adams, was the first successor, and again kind of created a stable succession line similar to the monarchy, except in America this would be through direct election of the American president by the people. And he approached the presidency with an idealized version of the monarchy, in that the president was ultimately there to uphold impartiality and integrity and not partisan lines, borrowing from the ideas of the concept of the divine rights of kings. And therefore he led in a leadership style that was somewhat disinterested to promote the ideals of the separation of the branches of government and establish that the presidency is a different institution. And he only asserted his authority when needed. So this is evident in how he handled the XYZ affair. So this occurred in October 1797 when the French minister tried to bribe US commissioners in forming a treaty. Upon hearing this information, Adams decided to disclose this to Congress, reiterating that these are egalitarian branches of government that depend on each other, different from Parliament and the monarchy's relationship. And also, as a result of this, they started preparing for a potential war as they were engaged in a quasi-war. It showed the presidency has the military power to create a Department of Navy and form troops for the Army. And one response to this was the Alien Sedition Acts, which was passed by Congress as a form to regulate naturalization and immigration and prohibit seditious behavior. So this received a lot of political opposition from the opposite party due to its attacks on freedom of speech and the First Amendment. And so John Adams, although not creating the laws, he chose to sign it, and he receives much blame for choosing to sign laws that were constitutionally questionable on the freedoms of speech. And by choosing to sign this, he does still receive blame. He also, by choosing to enforce it to his own interpretation, by not strictly enforcing it as possible, he asserted that the presidency has the right to enforce laws to his own discretion, again, similar to a monarch. However, due to these events, he lost his re-election in 1800, and by peacefully stepping down and allowing Jefferson to succeed him in power, he established the presidency as a decision by the will of the American people, and it is not a position for one to retain authority, unlike a monarch who might challenge oppositions to his power and try to stay there for life. And again, this influence has continued throughout US history, as evident in the 19th century with Andrew Jackson and Abraham Lincoln's expansion of power, with their treatment of Native Americans in a Supreme Court decision, and the issuing of Emancipation Proclamation, which expanded legislative powers of the presidency. In the 20th century, this is again evident in the court packing plan of FDR and the Watergate scandal of Nixon, which also asserted the presidency's authority over two branches of government, such as the Supreme Court and Congress. And in the 21st century, this still continues to exist with the Bush and Obama's administration's handling of the war on terror and expanding the presidency's military powers for an undeclared war to persist in the executive orders in these administrations. And again, the Trump and Biden's administration's reliance on these executive orders has continued to cause people to look at the president as an issuer of policy making rather than Congress. And so for this reason, the political influence of the monarchy still continues today and still persists. And so thank you. And are there any questions?
Hey, good job, Allison. This touches on so many frightfully current issues that the United States just had to wrestle with very, very recently, right? I have a couple questions. So first, peaceful transition of power. right? So we just experienced this in this country with an outgoing president who was a little reluctant to participate in that essentially time-honored tradition of supporting the person that the people elected to replace you. And so I wanted to get your opinion on how important is that moving forward? And are there other countries, are there other, kind of socio-political climates that have something like this that is not really reflective of the monarchy? That's kind of a uniquely US thing. What have you found?
I do not especially get into research about other countries, but I think that's a really interesting question. I think it's very important, just like seeing from the Adams administration, just how needed it is for when a party loses their spot in the White House for a peaceful transition to occur for the good of the country. So I think going forward, it's very important for the president to accept the results of the election, whether it's in their favor or their opponent's favor, just to uphold the ideals of this country and for democracy and for trust in the electoral system to continue. And I just think also to further reiterate the point that the presidency is ultimately a position decided by the American public, and it's not a position where the president gets to decide how long. And I think that's really important that this idea needs to be continued further out. And I think especially for the history of the United States.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I was also thinking, in no uncertain terms, we could all go on eBay right now and buy an AOC shirt. We could go buy a Ted Cruz shirt. We could go buy a Donald Trump shirt, for better or for worse, right? We glorify politicians. They become celebrities in this country like they are celebrities in monarchies. And Allison, I wanted to get your thoughts on the kind of celebration and celebrity nature of politicians. And is that a new thing? Has that always, I know presidents had pins back in the day and like little coins to commemorate elections and their flags and shirts, but has that ramped up in kind of recent memory, or what do you make of this kind of glorification and celebrity that's being made of politicians?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. My research didn't go too into that, but from what I understand, I think that glorification has been pretty present throughout time. Because even in the British system with the monarchy, the monarchs were considered celebrities. And even with the formation of the government, everyone knew who George Washington, John Adams were in this group of people who were. So I think that celebrity culture has persisted, probably with the advance of social media and just quicker information of news. It's become more and more present in society as more people are able to know the names than like perhaps maybe centuries before. But I think it's something that's probably been present probably throughout political history.
You know, I'm not sharing my screen with you, but my next question that I actually was thinking about, what Amanda was speaking about, is, has social media and technology accelerated that kind of notoriety and that celebrity? So how do you feel? Obviously the United States has been infinitely influenced by the United Kingdom. It was a lot of folks that came here left to escape that system for a variety of reasons. How do you think social media plays into that influence, and how will it in the future?
That's a good question. I think it's definitely promoted the more of the celebrity idea. And also just with social media, the more followers you have, the more influential you are. And so I think social media is now being used as a platform, especially in elections and campaigns, and also garnering public support. And it'll be interesting to see, just because social media really has just developed so much within the last 15 years, how the proliferation of it will continue, and especially like as younger generations eventually become people in these seats of power who grew up with this technology. I'm really interested to see just how the celebrity culture and just how the usage of it continues.
Yeah, that's fascinating too, thinking about how many followers an elected politician might have. So thinking about, let's say President Biden or Vice President Harris, their social media following versus someone like a Selena Gomez, and how influential you are in a space. And even though, you may or may not be elected, you still have considerable pull and information reach in our society. It's fascinating to think about. Fascinating stuff, y'all. Oh my gosh. Thank you for making my Saturday morning very enjoyable. I'm going to give everyone in the audience, we're creeping up on time, which, I'm glad we did. We should probably end at about the 80-minute mark. So we have just a few minutes left over. But if anyone has any questions, we're also, I think we have a little bit of time to open it up. I'm going to first kind of prioritize questions for Allison. So if you have any questions for Allison, please send those on over in the chat and I will direct those to Allison. But if you also have a question that may tie kind of a through line through all of the presentations, if you want to, double back to somebody else's presentation, please let me know. I'll watch the chat for the next minute or so. Closing thoughts, I will say, is all four speakers, first and foremost, you will get sterling feedback from me. No complaints on this side. I was very, very impressed. It's very inspiring too to see so many different research interests, but y'all went so deep into it and really invested in it. So that was very inspiring to me. I think a lot of times folks had mentioned the influence of social media and the news and how culture is transmitted through different media, and everything is bite-sized and it's instantaneous and in some ways disposable, right? I mean, a tweet can be sent out and then 15 minutes later, 2.5 million tweets just were tweeted, and that, impact and that influence may have been lost, but this is a long-term investment in people and in research and in sharing stories. So I'm very proud of each of you for doing that and committing that time, because I feel like as a society, our patience and our attention span has become increasingly short. And this is a demonstration of an incredibly long attention span and attention to detail and people deserve that. So kudos to everyone in the room. One follow-up question, Allison, implications of your research. Is there any policy advocacy? Are we gonna have 1-year term presidents? What are we thinking? What are the policy implications?
I think especially right now, it's really important to recognize how much the use of executive orders is being used by administrations, especially in the 21st century, and to realize that these aren't really laws. They can be reversed by the next presidential administrations. And instead of looking to the president to set policy, people should instead be looking to Congress and fixing the system of Congress to being less polarized so these decisions can be made for Congress, as is their constitutional authority. And also because these laws, if made in Congress, are going to be much more long lasting than they are in the presidency, because they're not even laws when they're executive orders. They're just issues by the president that can just be reversed by the next one, as evident just with how in the Obama administration, Trump administration, and Biden administration so far.
Fantastic point. And I think about all of our undocumented folks out there who, many of those folks live their lives election to election because so many of their rights and so many of their freedoms are dictated by executive orders, and the importance of writing that into law so it carries through multiple elected officials. That's a fantastic point, right? Those executive orders can be canceled from president to president, but laws are much harder to reverse or to amend. So it's a fantastic point there. Total agreement. Anybody else? And two, I guess, because we have a few minutes, we can probably go around the room. Anthony, is there anyone that you want to recognize? Any kind of final thoughts on your end, sir?
Let me unmute. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Awesome. One, you all did a fantastic job. So great job all around. That was really interesting. Just not that I have any questions specifically, because honestly, you guys, there's so much going on every single front, but I'm just really proud of you all, because I just know how difficult this was for every single one of us. We were all in class. We all saw each other going through it. So great job. You guys have actually made me want to dig into my research more and see kind of how, like, especially social media, like how that kind of play into our drug policy a little more. So just thank you. Thank you. That was really interesting. But I don't really have any questions or anything. You guys were just all great.
Awesome. Awesome. Apurva, do you want to make a really quick acknowledgement? We got about 2 minutes.
Sure. Yeah, I'm like so grateful for the engagement in this room, like Anthony said. So echoing his sort of feedback and how inspired it's making me to like finish out this project and really do justice for my participants and how much they shared with me. So yeah, thank you all
Awesome.
for being here on a Saturday morning, no less.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you. Amanda, we got about 1.5 minutes. Any final
Ditto, ditto to everything they said. They said it perfectly. I'm just super appreciative. Thank you to you, Dr. Taylor, for moderating this.
Yeah.
This has been fun, which I didn't think I was gonna say. So.
Oh yeah, love it. Happy to do it. Happy to do it. Allison, any final thoughts from you? We got about 45 seconds.
Yeah, thank you all for coming, especially on a Saturday morning. And thank you, Dr. Taylor, for moderating. And also, I just want to say congrats to everyone. I know this has been such a difficult year to write this, like virtually remotely, and also for our senior year of college to go this way. So I just want to say I'm so proud of how everyone has done. And I'm just thankful to have gone through this process with y'all.
Awesome. All right, with that, take care, everyone. Fantastic work. You'll get your feedback list from me very shortly, but go see someone else's presentation. Go support your fellow classmates. That would mean a lot. Have a great rest of the weekend. Have a great semester.